They say that if you press your ear against the cold walls of the Tower of London at dawn, you can hear her breathing. Anne's world shrank to a single cell, stone pressing against her spine when she tried to sleep. The stale air thick with the scent of damp straw and rusting chains, though she was not chained. That was mercy, they said. Mercy from a husband who once kissed her fingers in candlelight, promising kingdoms and eternity. Mercy from a king who now feasted elsewhere, the flicker of the fireplace in his chambers mirroring the glint of the sword prepared for her neck. But in this place, mercy was only another way of saying, "We want you to think before you die." She listened, at first, for footsteps her ladies who tried to comfort her. The priest who came in the mornings with his thin voice and trembling hands. But soon the footsteps blended into other sounds, the soft scurry of rats in the corners, the distant cawing of the ravens outside the barred window, the scrape of steel sharpening in the courtyard below. When she closed her eyes, the darkness behind her lids was not quiet. It was filled with whispers. Who had prayed until their lips cracked, and bled who had screamed so loudly the walls themselves had cracked under the sound? Anne felt those cracks beneath her fingers, tiny fractures in the stone, where she sometimes placed her palm, pressing, as if she could escape into them. Sometimes she would sit up in the darkness, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders, hearing voices that were not there. Her father's voice, her brother's voice, the voices of the men she was accused of sinning with, voices that begged and screamed in dreams she could not wake from. Traitor, they hissed. She tried to eat, but her stomach rebelled. The child she once carried was gone, taken by grief, or by God, or by the king's disgust. She could not say. She tried to pray, but the prayers turned to dry ashes in her mouth, tasting of betrayal and fear. Whore, queen. The tower itself was alive, breathing with the ghosts of men and women who had wept and begged they brought her stale bread, watered wine. Nights were the worst. The walls seemed to breathe with her, expanding and contracting in the dark, the shadows of the torchlight sliding like dark fingers across her face. Sometimes she would sit up in the darkness, clutching the thin blanket around her shoulders, hearing voices that were not there, her father's voice, her brother's voice, and tried to imagine her daughter's face. But each time she tried, the vision blurred, replaced by the faces of the guards. Who would lead her to the scaffold? The voices of the men she was accused of sinning with. Voices that begged and screamed in dreams she could not wake from. They watched the windows of the tower, waiting. They always waited. She sat on the narrow bed, praying, weeping, whispering to herself. She heard the clock of St. Peter ad Vincula toll the hours, each chime a reminder that the world was moving closer to the dawn, closer to the moment her name would be spoken one last time by the priest, before the sword would speak the final word over her life. She thought of Elizabeth, red-haired. Fear sighed. A child too young to know what it meant to lose a mother in the dark. It is said that on the last night, and did not sleep, outside, the ravens shuffled on the battlements, their black feathers catching the moonlight, and now stood on the edge of death with her eyes open, refusing to look away. And so, the walls of the tower whispered, absorbing her last breaths, her last prayers, her last trembling words to her ladies, who clung to her hands and wept quietly so she would not hear their fear. They whispered of a queen undone, of a mother who would leave her child, of a woman who had once captivated a king, they whispered, so that even now, if you press your ear against the walls, you may still hear her there, waiting, listening, breathing. They say he was laughing the day before she died. Henry, once so quick to praise the curve of Anne's lips and the sharpness of her mind, now turned his face from her as easily as one might turn from a dead bird in the road. In the grand halls of Greenwich the king moved through shadows of banners and flickering torches, the scent of roasted meats thick in the air. Jesters leaping for his amusement, as he lifted his goblet, red wine staining his mouth like a wound. He did not feel. They say he smiled that day, smiled as his new queen, Jane Seymour, passed him in the corridors with downcast eyes, her pale face a ghost of the woman who waited in the tower, counting her last hours, and knew the betrayal was not sudden, for it had begun long before the charges of treason and incest. It had begun in the small silences at the table, the way Henriette's eyes slid away from hers when she tried to speak of Elizabeth's future, the way he pulled his hand back when she reached for him. They say he laughed when the messenger came, asking if the execution should proceed. They say he nodded and turned back to the chase, the wind cold on his face, the hounds barking in the brush, while the woman who once crowned him with her love prepared to die in silence. It was in the way the court changed its laughter when she entered a room, the way even her allies began to bow more deeply, more carefully, as if fearing that her shadow might stain them. But it was not until she was behind those walls, the cold of the tower creeping into her bones, that she saw the betrayal for what it was, a quiet, endless desertion. As Henry closed the door on her, life without even the decency of anger, they say he went hunting the morning she was meant to die, and had once believed in the promises he whispered beneath the tapestries. In the soft darkness of rooms heavy with the scent of beeswax and roses, she had believed when he swore she was his only love, his salvation, the mother of the son who would rule England. She had believed him even as the child in her womb turned cold, even as the midwives wept, even as the king's eyes grew hard. In the tower, she lay awake, clutching the memory of those promises like a dying flame, trying to believe that the man she had given everything to would save her. But the silence from Greenwich was more final than any sentence. According to some accounts, when Anne was told of her execution date, she laughed a soft, brittle laugh that startled the women attending her, a laugh that held the brittle edge of a mirror shattering. They say she laughed because she understood at last that there would be no last-minute reprieve, no softening of the king's will, no whispered mercy in the darkness. Henry had chosen the swordsman. It was said to be a kindness, a swifter death than the axe, a clean cut that would spare her the humiliation of a botched execution. But it was not mercy, it was inefficiency that allowed Henry to move forward, to clear the space beside him for Jane Seymour, to erase Anne with the same quickness that he had once pursued her. In the days before her execution, Anne's ladies found her standing by the window, eyes searching the river beyond the tower walls, watching the ripples of the grey water, perhaps hoping to see a boat bringing a pardon, a sign, a letter with the king's seal. It was quiet, It was the sound of a door closing in the dark, the rustle of paper, as the king signed her death warrant. The walls pressing closer, the silence pressing closer. The knowledge of the king's indifference pressing closest of all. The distant laughter of the court as they prepared for another wedding, another queen, another hope for a son. Nothing came. The betrayal was not loud. It was not thunderous. They say that on the final night, and whispered her forgiveness for him, her betrayal-soaked prayers. Rising toward the cold ceiling as she lay in the darkness, she forgave him. Perhaps. Or perhaps she did not. And in that quiet, endless silence, the betrayal was complete. It is said that on the dawn of her final morning, the ravens came early. They settled along the ramparts of the tower, black wings folded like funeral drapery, eyes like cold glass, as they watched the scaffold being swept clean of last night's rain. The boards were damp, smelling of wet wood and iron, and each hammer strike echoed across the grey courtyard wherein Boleyn would soon walk. Her ladies surrounded her, pale and silent, their eyes swollen from weeping. She spoke softly to them, her voice trembling only when she mentioned Elizabeth, the child she would leave behind, to the mercy of a father who had none. Inside, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap. The guards who came for her did not look into her eyes, as they led her through the cold corridors of the tower past the chapel, where prayers still clung to the stones like ghosts past the iron doors that would close behind her for the last time. They dressed her carefully, each movement deliberate, as if to delay the moment when the world would claim her life. But Henry was not there. He would not come. He would not see what he had ordered. Some say she paused, looking up at the sky, breathing deeply as the cold air filled her lungs, the scent of rain and river and blood mingling in the morning mist. Her gown was of dark grey damask, simple, unadorned, the fabric whispering as it fell around her ankles. She asked for her mantle of ermine, the symbol of her queenship, but it was denied her. The crown was gone. The title was gone. The world had shrunk to this cell, these stone walls, these final breaths that fogged the cold morning air. Outside, the scaffold was prepared with buckets of sand to catch the blood, to keep it from running into the cracks of the courtyard, though no amount of sand could truly contain what was to come. Nobles stood with guarded expressions, trying not to meet her eyes, while the common people pressed closer, eager to see the fall of a queen, the ending of a story they had all whispered about. Behind closed doors, they say she stepped forward without faltering, though her legs trembled beneath her skirts. When she stepped into the grey light, the ravens shifted, black wings rustling, as if acknowledging the presence of the condemned queen. The crowd was waiting, packed into the courtyard, their breath rising in pale clouds, their faces pale with fear and hunger for the spectacle. Anne's eyes scanned the crowd, searching, perhaps, for a familiar face, for a sign of mercy, for a glimpse of the man who had loved her once. But Henry was not there. He would not come. He would not see what he had ordered. According to some accounts, as she walked toward the scaffold, a single raven took flight, circling above her head 3 times before vanishing into the low clouds. Some said it was an omen, a sign that her spirit would not rest, that her blood would stain the kingdom, that the child she left behind would one day return to claim what was denied her mother. He was said to have been the best, swift and precise, chosen to spare her suffering. The priest waited to offer her the final prayers, his hands shaking as he held the small wooden cross before her. But to Anne, the promise of a swift death was a cold comfort in the biting wind of that morning. The French executioner stood ready, his sword hidden behind his back, a dark silhouette against the pale boards. The scaffold creaked beneath her as she climbed the steps, each footstep echoing in the courtyard, where the crowd fell into a heavy silence, and knelt. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her hood, pushing her hair beneath the fabric to clear her neck for the sword. Her last act of dignity in a world that had stripped her of everything. She whispered her last prayers, her voice too soft for the crowd to hear. Though her ladies wept openly, clutching each other, unable to look away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river, the damp earth, and the presence of the ravens who remained, watching, waiting. As the final dawn of Anne Boleyn's life settled into silence, and the world, for a moment, held its breath. According to some accounts, the executioner was instructed to hide the sword behind his back, so that the queen would not see the steel that would end her life. They say he was a master of the blade, a man brought from Calais at great expense, summoned under the guise of mercy. Though mercy felt thin on the cold wind that morning, he wore a black hood, or perhaps he did not, for the stories shift like shadows. She lifted her eyes once toward the pale sky, the grey clouds drifting, the cries of gulls from the river, beyond the walls mingling with the quiet sobs of her ladies, and prayers for the king, the man who had once sworn to love her above all others. It is said that her lips trembled only once when she spoke of Henry, but she did not weep. The queen would not give them that, but all agree on this. He was calm, precise, and swift, a craftsman of death, and knelt upon the straw that had been scattered to catch her blood, the rough fibers pressing into her knees as she folded her hands in prayer. In his hands, the blade was hidden, the polished steel catching the pale dawn light only when he shifted, quick as a breath, before hiding it again behind his back. She spoke then, her voice clear but soft, offering forgiveness to those who had condemned her, and then called to his assistant for the sword, though the sword was already in his hand. A trick to draw her eyes away to distract her so that her body would remain still, so that her fear would not twist her at the last moment, so that the blade could find its mark. In one clean sweep, the priest stepped away, clutching his book, the Latin words half finished upon his tongue as he backed from the scaffold, his eyes downcast, unable to watch. The executioner moved around her, barefoot upon the boards, his footsteps careful, soundless, like a shadow across water. It was said that he spoke softly to her, "Madam, do not fear," and turned, her head, expecting the sword to be brought forward, and in that breath of confusion, in that single moment of looking away, the sword flashed. The air split, sharp and cold, and for an instant, the world was silent. They say that those who were close enough to see the blade fall never forgot the sound. It made a wet crack that echoed across the courtyard, the sound of steel parting flesh and bone, the sound of breath leaving a body forever. Her body fell in a slow collapse, the crimson blooming beneath her, seeping into the straw. steam rising in the cold morning as the blood met the air. Anne's head fell forward, rolling across the straw, her dark hair tumbling loose from the hood as her eyes stared, empty, at the pale boards. The silence was heavy, pressing, a silence that felt like a curse upon all who stood there. The executioner lifted her head by the hair, showing it to the silent crowd, the Queen's face pale, her eyes half closed, her lips still parted as if to speak one last word. The ravens shifted along the battlements, black wings fluttering as they watched, as if waiting for permission to descend, down to the river out into the city that would awaken to news that the Queen was dead. Anne's ladies fell to their knees, weeping their cries the only sound in the courtyard. The wind carrying their grief over the walls, they wrapped her head and body in white cloth, the crimson seeping through almost immediately, and carried her to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where an arrow chest was used in place of a coffin, the wood rough and splintered, unworthy of a queen, where mercy was only another form of cruelty, where love ended in silent steel and blood. The blade was cleaned in silence, wiped down with rags that were later burned, the boards washed, the sand gathered up and thrown into the river to hide the evidence of what had been done. But the river remembered, the walls remembered, and it is said the ravens remember still waiting each year on that day, their black eyes watching the tower where a queen lost her head to a hidden blade, where mercy was only another form of cruelty, where love ended in silence, steel, and blood. Although not officially recorded, many believe that the moment the sword fell, the air itself paused. They say that even the ravens stopped their shifting on the battlements, that the soft weeping of Anne's ladies caught in their throats, that the murmurs of the gathered crowd froze, trapped between breath and silence, as if the world itself recoiled from what it had just witnessed. Anne's blood steamed upon the cold boards, the crimson spreading like the petals of a crushed rose, seeping into the straw meant to contain the evidence of a queen's erasure. The executioner's blade, still trembling with the memory of its swift violence, was lowered, cleaned in hurried, fearful gestures, as if those who touched it believed the steel might whisper the last breath of the woman it had severed, carrying away the last note of her voice, leaving behind only the echo of silence where a queen's breath had once been, threading its cold fingers through the hair of the onlookers, lifting the scent of blood into the pale morning. In that moment there was no cheering, no cries of triumph, only the hollow sound of the wind. As it moved across the courtyard, a low hum of sorrow that could be felt beneath one's feet. A coldness that seemed to cling to the walls long after the blood had been scrubbed away. Some said they could hear the river's slow lapping against the stone walls of the tower, the sound soft and relentless, carrying away the memory of Anne's final prayer. They wept openly now, their sobs raw and echoing off the stone walls as they carefully wrapped their head and body in white linen. Some looked back over their shoulders, unable to tear their eyes from the crimson pool that remained, from the image of a young queen silenced forever by a single stroke. Their fingers stained red as they tied the fabric closed, their grief turning to quiet prayers that stumbled from their lips. Anne's ladies, trembling, moved forward, their faces pale with shock, their skirts dragging through the blood as they knelt to gather what was left of their mistress. The crowd began to disperse, their faces blank, as if unable to comprehend the speed with which a life could be ended. They say the tower itself felt different that day, as if the stones had absorbed the violence and now held it within. A low hum of sorrow that could be felt beneath one's feet. A coldness that seemed to cling to the walls long after the blood had been scrubbed away. In the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, an arrow chest was hastily prepared. The rough would not meant for the body of a queen. But there was no time, no ceremony, no honor. Anne's body was lowered into the box, her head placed beside her, wrapped in the same linen, the silence of the chapel broken only by the whispered prayers of the priest who dared not raise his voice. The sunlight flickered across the river, across the city that continued to live, to breathe, to move forward, even as the memory of a queen's death hung heavy in the morning air. Above the tower, the clouds broke, allowing a single ray of pale sunlight to fall across the yard where the scaffold still stood. The boards damp with blood and water, the sand darkened to near black. He was miles away, already turning his eyes toward the future, toward another wife, toward the promise of the son he still desperately sought. His laughter ringing in halls where Anne's name would no longer be spoken. Henry was not there to witness the silence, to feel the cold, to see the moment the world held its breath. But the silence remained. In the black eyes of the ravens who took flight when the crowd finally dispersed, the silence remained heavy and sharp, a reminder that in the blink of a blade, a queen could be forgotten, erased, unmade. In the tower, in the river, in the hearts of those who had watched in the trembling hands of the women, who washed the blood from their skirts, and for that single moment, the world was silent. Although historians are divided, one version says that Boleyn's ghost walks the tower still, carrying her head beneath her arm as she glides silently through the corridors, where she once prayed for mercy that never came. They say she is seen on dark, rain-heavy nights, her gown whispering along the cold stones, the scent of wet straw and iron clinging to the air in her wake. The guards who walk the tower's ramparts report the soft sound of footsteps, where no feet should fall, a flicker of dark fabric, rounding a corner where no one waits a cold wind that follows them down narrow staircases where the light of their torches dims for a moment as if the shadows themselves breathe. They say she walks the green where the scaffold once stood, the place where the boards drank her blood, where the ravens watched with their cold black eyes, where the morning air once held the sharp scent of steel and the silence of the world as breath caught in its throat. Anne's ghost does not weep, they say, her presence a quiet act of vengeance against the father who had taken her mother's life. She does not scream. She does not reach for the living with cold, grasping hands. She simply walks, her head held close, her eyes turned toward the river, toward the wide gray sky, toward a future she never saw, her silence heavier than any cry of rage. Elizabeth never spoke of an openly, but the echo of her mother's name remained in the hush of the tower walls. A promise that the blood spilled on that scaffold would not be in vain. Hidden unmarked for years her body and head placed together in that rough arrow chest that served as her coffin, and watching as if she waits for a justice that never came, for the daughter she left behind, for the man who once swore he loved her, only to sign her death in silence. Sometimes the candles in the chapel gutter and flicker when she pauses, their flames bending as if a breath of cold air has moved through the room. Though the doors remain tightly closed, she moves with the calm dignity denied to her in death, pausing in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where her bones lie beneath the cold stone floor sometimes. Visitors claim to see her standing near the altar, her head cradled in her arms, her dark eyes open. It is said that Elizabeth, her daughter, returned to the tower years later, as queen, her footsteps echoing in the same corridors wherein once walked Anne's ghost, they say, is not vengeful. She does not scream, she does not reach for the living with cold, grasping hands. She simply walks, her head held close, her eyes turned toward the river, toward the wide grey sky, toward a future she never saw, her silence heavier than any cry of rage. They claim they hear the soft rustle of fabric, the lightest sigh in the dark, the almost imperceptible whisper of a woman's voice, repeating a prayer learned long ago, her words trailing off into the cold silence of the tower. They say that on the anniversary of her death the ravens gather on the tower walls. In greater numbers, their wings darkening the dawn, their cries harsh in the cold air, as if calling to the spirit who cannot leave the place of her death. On those mornings the tower feels colder, the air heavy, the walls whispering, with the memory of prayers spoken in fear, and the memory of a single terrible moment when the world went silent, and a queen was unmade, of a blade hidden behind a Frenchman's back, of the final breath of a queen who once believed in love. Some guards refuse to walk certain corridors alone on those nights, and in the darkest hours before dawn, when the world is silent, and the river moves like a black ribbon beyond the walls, and Boleyn's ghost is said to walk one last time across the place, where the scaffold once stood, pausing beneath the shadow of the ravens, her head resting in her arms, her eyes turned upward toward the stars hidden by the clouds. She does not vanish when the first light touches the stones. She simply turns away, her footsteps fading into the hush of the tower, leaving behind the scent of wet straw, and the tower remembers. It always remembers.